Welcome to another conversation in People in Fundraising. This podcast features interviews with nonprofit professionals who discuss their career journeys, lessons learned, and enthusiasm for working in fundraising. And here is your host, the founder of People in Fundraising, Tim Wilson.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tim Wilson. It is Monday, October 24th, 2022. And thank you for joining us for another People in Fundraising professional conversation. And today, I'm really excited to welcome Jon Schaffrath to our program. Jon, how are you?
I'm doing well, Tim. I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. Truly an honor. Thank you.
Well, the honor is mine. Thank you for making time for this conversation today. What's the term, Jon?
I'm the Director of Development, Strategic Initiatives. Rolls right off the tongue. Basically means that I get to work on some really exciting projects, engaging new frontiers of prospects around entrepreneurs, life sciences, and technology.
Awesome. Thank you. And Jon, you've been at Harvard Business School for many years. We overlapped for quite a few years. How long have you been at HBS?
Coming up on 17 years.
Dynamite.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Very good place to be.
Well, Jon, let's start, 17 years track record at HBS. If you can take us back in time, how did you enter the fundraising profession? And if you want to take some time to talk about some of the roles, responsibilities you've had over your tenure at Harvard Business School, that would be interesting.
Sure. You're expecting me to remember 17 years ago? I can't remember 17 days ago. 3 young kids and a busy job and all that sort of stuff. But no, I'd be happy to, Tim. And it was early on when I worked here at HBS, I did get the pleasure of overlapping with you and your role, which I very much enjoyed. I sort of see that people get into this field sort of more or less 2 ways. They either were a student caller when they were on campus doing fundraising, or everyone says, I just sort of fell into it. So yeah. I think there's other ways we should be encouraging people to get into the field, but we can get to that later. Mm-hmm. I would say that I'm in the fall into it category. I was working in hospitality at the Country Club here in Brookline, Massachusetts, running events, big and small, and at a sort of elite institution with a lot of service-oriented activity going on. And through my work there and the fact that I graduated with a business degree but didn't want to go into finance or accounting, sort of was at a bit of a standstill on what was next. And I had some members at the Country Club who also went to Harvard Business School, went to Harvard, and they actually sort of tipped me off to this profession. I applied for something that I was not at all qualified for. I would have that role probably 7 to 10 years later in my time at HBS.
Oh, wow.
But kindly, the hiring manager at the time, a woman named Ginny Wise down at Tulane, took my resume out of the stack, said, hey, you're not qualified for that, but do you want to come in and talk about being a staff assistant, which is sort of the entry-level role here, or was the entry-level role here into development. And also sort of did some outreach, found out my 8th grade teacher was in development at the Harvard Law School, and a bunch of confirmations that this is something that could be interesting. And at the time, wasn't looking at it as a career, was really looking at higher ed as a space and sort of sector to be in.
Oh, interesting. Were there, as you starting out as a staff assistant at HBS, were there other avenues, other realms of possibility in the fundraising space that attracted you early on in that part of your career? You mentioned at the time you weren't thinking of fundraising as the career path necessarily for you.
Yeah, so coming out of events, there was a part of me that was drawn to events in sort of the development or alumni relations space. I didn't know it existed. So I wasn't specifically looking towards that, but I would say maybe less often today, but sort of not as uncommon back then. You sort of get tracked in, and I sort of felt like I was going up the individual giving sort of path. And so after some time in a support role, I was a reunion class giving officer for 5 years, where I managed class fundraising campaigns, which is a great way to really get to know sort of soup to nuts what the fundraising experience is at any institution, including mine here at HBS. And then was able to transition from that after really enjoying the relationship part. I mean, at the end of the day, so much of this work comes down to relationships, which I'm sure others have echoed on this podcast. But the relationships really motivated me, and I wanted to keep them beyond the 18 months that I was working with the class, and that was sort of my transition then to major gifts and frontline work.
Oh, interesting. That's really, yeah. And I mean, speaking about relationships, I just want to mention that we had a prior guest on the People in Fundraising podcast, Ron Bembry, who mentioned you by name as someone who was very instrumental in mentoring him, and as he was starting out on his fundraising path as well. So yeah, the relationship piece is really critical in our field.
Yeah, no, Ron's terrific, and I've been thrilled to stay in touch and stay connected to him as he's found his way in the field. And I'd be remiss. I should call out then Tracy Van Dorpe, who was a tremendous mentor for me when I started here. And then a gentleman, Prescott Stewart, is someone who I've long sort of admired the way he approaches fundraising, as well as the people in fundraising. There you go, for your podcast. But really great in terms of the way he built relationships and tried to encourage others in the field and mentor and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to touch on that a little bit, or expand on that a little bit. So relationships certainly are key. And as you were going from the staff assistant and the reunion cycle, and then thinking about more long-term engagement with individuals at a major gift level, I imagine obviously mentors are really helpful in that path. Were there other tools that were helpful, like, case conferences or other conferences, or networking that really helped you to go on to a slightly different path?
Well, so I'm sort of a sucker for education. My mom's a teacher, and she always was sharing that sort of knowledge is power. And we are a family that has, advanced degrees for good reasons, but also just because education is interesting. So I think there was a big part of, early on, I took courses in fundraising. I took a certificate program. I really enjoyed and was blessed by the organization that I'm at, that they encouraged that. So I think that was a big part of it. And then the other thing I would say, and it sort of falls into mentoring, although not as directly, I just watched what people were doing and took it from a frame of, I don't know what my style is going to be. I don't know how I'm not looking for one person that I just want to be like them. I was sort of looking for the parts that, the parts that different people express on how they do their fundraising, and sort of pick things up. So sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to call out sort of like specific mentors, because I always found the opportunity, whether it was the person who was managing me at the time, or others in the office, or others in the field doing networking and otherwise, to sort of try to pick out the things that I thought were particularly effective or interesting, from how they actually do the work to sort of their style and how they sort of present themselves with other colleagues and in the field, really.
Oh, interesting. I want to touch on a few of those, if we can. From my side of the fundraising table in prospect development, contact reports are certainly one of the key measures of how gift officers are engaging and following up with prospects and donors. So what was helpful from the people you were watching as it related to how much content, what was most important to put into contact reports, trip debriefs, whatever people call it at their own institutions?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two things. One, I would say I always, and learning from some other people, your memory can do funny things. You don't always remember things exactly how they happened. And remembering sort of details that are important in a relationship. But as we all know, these are relationships you're building with the alumnus or prospect and your institution. So we're the conduit in that relationship. But along the way, the institution's not going to remember someone's, third birthday, but it'd be helpful if you did. So I always had a bias to put more into contact reports, and found that those people who really were capturing a lot of the details of the conversations, and sort of, it was less about the specific priorities you were updating the individual on. That can be one line, but their response and sort of what it elicited. So I always found that to be helpful, and sort of more is more, which is good. And then I've seen over the years, and I always get a little bit of a chuckle out of it, because I'm never sure. I'm like, well, it was my memory, but a prospect researcher might take a piece of information out of one of those contact reports and sort of note that as part of, the number of children they have, or philanthropic interests, or things like that. I've also really focused on my first sort of 10 to 15 minutes of a conversation in really getting to know what today is like for the prospect that I'm with, asking them how they're feeling about their company or their family or the economy generally. While that can be sometimes lead you a little bit of a drift, I find that the information I gather in there is really helpful in the overall relationship, as well as that specific conversation. I can learn right there if they're stressed out because the kids missed piano, or the economy is down, or their company is not hitting a target. Or I can find out if they're sort of everything seems to be shaken. That can, if I'm going to ask someone for a significant gift at the later end of that conversation, it really can impact what I'm going to do and sort of how I'm going to do that.
Well, that's so cool. Thank you for sharing that. Because, from my perspective, I've always wondered, because you mentioned, and you're right, that prospect researchers often sift out of contact reports other data points that can be packaged into future research bios. So I've just wondered, how, obviously everyone's an individual and have different ideas of what to put in, but that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing.
No problem. Well, I'll also give a shout out. The prospect research team, what they do the most for me is just gives me great confidence to go into these meetings. So whether it be having unearthed their capacity and sort of having a sense of what they could actually give if so inspired, or information on their company or family, it really, I would say it's hard to pinpoint exactly the information that I use, but I feel so much more confident going into a meeting when I have that background, and it really is then gives you the freedom to do a lot of different things. So big shout out to the prospect research team.
Thanks for that shout out. And I really enjoyed working with you I was there for 17 years as well. So it was great. Yeah. Yeah. So let's touch on that for a moment. What has kept you at Harvard Business School for the length of time you've been there, Jon?
Yeah, so I would say the people. So internally, I've had the great opportunity to work with a number of colleagues. I'm really blessed that there's a set of colleagues who've been here for a long time, who I've worked with over many, many years, as well as I get equally motivated by the colleagues who come in and they're here for 2 to 3 years and move on to something else. I learn a lot of different things, different perspectives. I really enjoy both Harvard Business School, and a school that I'm passionate about the mission and the work that we do, and the craft of fundraising in our industry. So I always get so much from both people who've been here forever and sort of feel that deep commitment to the school, as well as people who might not have built that yet, but have deep knowledge in the field. And then I would juxtapose that with the people externally. The prospects and alumni that I get to work with are incredibly inspiring. Those who will take my call, I have to say, I am always shocked at their willingness to step up, be helpful, give of their time, which is sometimes even harder to do than giving of their resources, and really help the school be as successful as they can be, both in big ways, like the significant philanthropy that they give, but also in small ways. I often sit with prospects and have them help me puzzle out some initiative that I'm working on, or help me figure out who I should be connecting with. And in doing so, they're being incredibly helpful, and they're some of the busiest people in the world, literally. And it is still 17 years later, shocking to me sometimes that people will even give me a half hours of their time. But for that, I'm so appreciative.
Yes, yeah, that's really cool. Thanks for sharing those insights. Speaking of Harvard Business School, I've thrown some impromptu questions at Jon, and he handled them with great enthusiasm and rolled with it well.
I'm a frontline fundraiser, Tim. I ought to be able to. I should be able to take anything.
Very good. My next question that I sent to Jon ahead of time, and Jon is going to get into this in a moment. It comes from a Harvard Business School professor, Harvard Kennedy School professor as well, from The Atlantic. He writes a weekly column every Thursday, Arthur Brooks. And to quote him in a recent New York Times piece, he said that the meaning of jobs comes from moments. So, Jon, as you consider that quote and as you reflect on the nearly 20 years in fundraising, and you've talked about some of those touch points already, specifically, moments that have given you meaning, have enriched your career path, maybe personally and professionally, anything that comes to mind in those realms?
So I'll borrow my framework that I just laid out with the people sort of internally and externally. I mean, I think, the moments continue to come up. So one example is just the time by someone's office door, talking to them. So, last week I'm talking to a colleague and they're trying to figure out a situation with a prospect and sort of some internal dynamics around it, and just the ability to sort of be free with thoughts and share opinions, respond to other ideas. That to me is so much of why I enjoy this work. And I would say I was able to find those times in fully Zoom world as well. They were a little bit harder. But those moments, with colleagues who sort of standing outside their door are sort of what came to mind. And then I'll say that, a moment that comes up with the longevity here, I like to call it the longevity dividend. So I would say far too often people, and I'm really happy to be talking with you, Tim, who's been committed to organizations and time, but far too often people move a little bit too quickly from organization to organization. And one of the moments, I was just with someone in September in New York and had a half-hour meeting with them, an alumnus who I've worked with for 10 years. I left that meeting feeling just on an incredible high, because we were talking about things that were important to him. He didn't have to fill in every new detail about his life. We were talking about sort of kids, profession, and the school. We were talking about new ways that he just wrapped up some engagement. We were figuring out new ways. And there really is something, and again, I'm fully understand that there's many reasons people move jobs. But I don't think we talk enough about sort of the dividend of being around and having prospects for some time. It just makes the work easier, and it creates some of these moments that just make you feel that much more inspired and engaged. And I could count. There's a number of those people that I feel lucky enough to have the opportunity to work with. And I know I left a message for a colleague after one of those meetings, and I said, this is I literally said, this is the moment, I'm really enjoying my job right now, because we're all busy. Job's not fun all the time, of course. Life gets in the way of all those things, but it's good to reflect when you actually are enjoying it.
Absolutely. And that's a really helpful and healthy perspective. So thanks for sharing that. And that's been on my mind too. I didn't have that term, the longevity dividend, but I really like it. And I think for me, I see it with impacting directly, like when a gift officer leaves, we have to unassign them from all of their assigned prospects. That's a small piece of it, though, because the larger piece, the impact, is that the institution also has to restart a relationship with those donors and prospects. As the new person coming in gets acclimated to the institution's culture and the HR mandatory trainings, and that you're right that longevity does have a real impact and dividend for good. for the person's career, for the institution. And that's something I think can get lost sometimes. Just people moving around pretty quickly. There is that impact as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, Jon, I want to pivot, if that's okay, just keeping track of our time. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about specifically to HBS or your role currently before we go on to a different segment?
I think just the last thing I would share is, part sort of going along with this sort of longevity piece. I mean, there is, and I've been, blessed to have this at my organization, a commitment the organization's making as well. And there's new opportunities that come up. And so the thing that I'm doing now, working with some different segments of alumni more broadly on some strategy versus sort of individual prospect orientation, is something that's relatively new for me. And, I think figuring out how to be open to those new opportunities as well is and open to them within the organization that you have. So obviously the opportunity has to exist. But also I think that sometimes we can get a little bit in a rut as well, where we look for sort of the next higher position in the same track. And, the tracks can change. And I think the future of fundraising and philanthropy is going to be much broader than leadership that solely has track record of fundraising track record. I think it'll be those who can have a sense of the broader organization and sort of the strategy behind some of the reasons that we do things, which I also think is great because it'll encourage leadership to come from all parts of the organization as well, and not simply sort of responding to those who raise the most money, because sometimes those people are really great at raising the most money, but they might not be outfitted to sort of manage teams and strategies.
That's interesting. I'd like to have you on again in a few years and see what traction, what headway and if you're collaborating or bouncing the idea around with others, what the results may be. Because I've talked to a few other people that have touched on similar senses of a need to revitalize, change the fundraising landscape, organizational structure. I had a guest from California back in June who talked about organizations needing to develop leadership roles for people, particularly on the front line, but also others who don't want to manage. They're very comfortable and very successful being strong individual contributors. So what you're talking about is also really timely and interesting. So maybe there'll be a part 2.
Happy to come back to him.
Awesome.
Assuming it goes well. No, I'm happy to share if it doesn't go well.
Terrific. Well, Jon, we've got a little less than a half hour left. I'd like to pivot now, if that's okay with you, and introduce the second professional hat that Jon wears. He is currently the program director in the Certificate of Professional Fundraising at Boston University. And Jon, I'd love to give you a few minutes to talk about the certificate, how you got involved, students, demographics, and other things that can then spark some questions.
Sure thing. So as referenced earlier, I'm a glutton for educational punishment. So one of the things I actually did early on was I took this program. And at the time this was back in 2007, it was all in person at Boston University. And I swear it was only hosted on nights that there were Red Sox games. So it was like a huge Boston University's right in Kenmore Square where Fenway is. And so always a huge challenge to get there, but well worth it and interesting. And I particularly found it helpful as a new person to the field to understand sort of the broader fundraising landscape. So fast forward a bunch of years, I have a fantastic mentor and someone who's helped bring me along sort of in some of these tangential opportunities to be involved with education. His name's Frank White. I took his class here at Harvard at the Harvard Extension School. He offered 2 fundraising classes. and following, and this is sort of a little unsolicited advice, but if there's something you want to do, you should just ask for it. So following two of the classes, I had told him, if ever you needed a TA or someone to help out, please let me know. I hope you consider me. There was someone who was also working at Harvard at the time who was helping him out at the time.
Oh.
And I heard nothing back for a while. And then 3 years later, Frank was actually in touch and said, his person who had been working with him was moving on to something else and asked that I asked if I wanted to be involved. This is a long story to say. I helped him TA for a while, and then he actually was involved at BU through this program.
Oh.
And so with his generosity, he helped bring me over there to start teaching in the program. The program moved from in-person to hybrid to fully online and asynchronous. And through that transition, the sort of head of the program, who is like me, a practitioner, he retired. And as they looked around, they asked if I could help out with some things as they sort of revamped the program. And over time, I've just been able to get more and more involved. It's absolutely terrific. And that's not anything to do with me. It has everything to do with the now, I think, 12 instructors and facilitators that we have that run the program.
Wow.
So it's a 12-week certificate program, all asynchronous, with a couple live classrooms throughout the week. Each week is a different module. So we literally cover everything from prospect research to frontline fundraising, capital campaigns, events, stewardship. Part of what I love about it is that it does cover sort of all different parts, so it gives exposure. And we run it 3 times a year. So
awesome.
It has some 50-ish students each time. We're focusing on continuing to grow that enrollment. We're focusing on international students as well. And let me just give you this a quick profile of who might take it, because it sort of speaks to part of what's really important to me in sort of this field. I sort of talked earlier, I said there ought to be more ways to get people into this field. And so the people that we target and that sort of get a lot out of the program are people looking to switch into the field at any age or stage in their career. Those who are looking to grow in the field. So oftentimes leaders within an organization are valued for knowing the whole organization. This course helps you to do that. And there's so that on the way up, sort of as I saw my education, sort of adding to it over time. And then often we get people sort of at tops of organizations who might have come up through one track and they're looking for a broader piece of it. And then the really inspiring group, which has been completely organic, but we get a bunch of volunteers who sign up, people who care deeply about their organization. They're on a board and they want to be the best fundraisers they can be for the organization. And they're paying their way to do that because they just care so much, which I think is awesome, truly inspiring.
That is so cool. Excellent. And so it's 3 times a year you mentioned. So what are the cycles of the courses?
So we have a winter spring program that starts in January, one that starts in May for the summer, and one that starts in September. And so right now we're active in enrollments for the January version. And what's really neat, and what I sort of referenced it, but just to go deeper, the course content is all practice oriented, and the course instructors all are coming from practice. So you're learning about plan giving from a plan giving officer. You're learning about stewardship from someone who's been doing stewardship, and the team is really grown because they've really enjoyed it, but also stayed really solid. The core group of people who are there are really strong. So
awesome. And given that it's asynchronous, are your faculty from around the country, around the world?
Yeah, so we're not quite around the world yet, but we are around the country. So we have a core group here in Boston because, sort of as networks develop and sort of the group that started with the team are still involved. So Boston, New Hampshire, East Coast, and then we have a bunch of people on the West Coast.
Nice.
So we are able to provide, and all sorts of institutions. So there's some at sort of a big higher ed, but we also have someone at the Mass Cultural Council. There's someone at a small foundation. There's hospitals, and because the students that the program attracts really are across all different backgrounds.
Really neat. And I had the pleasure a couple of times to be a mentor for a student in a couple of different cycles through this program. Jon was kind enough to think of me and invite me. And it really was a fulfilling and not a lot of heavy lift to be a mentor. It was, maybe 2 meetings over Zoom for about 15, 30 minutes, depending on what the student needed. I've mentored or helped to mentor through the program. I think it was 3 or 4 people. And to one of Jon's points earlier, my last mentee was a man who was serving on a board as a volunteer. He was retired, but serving as a board member, and had very little exposure to philanthropy, nonprofit work. He was probably in his early 60s, but just the lifelong learning enthusiasm that he brought was really inspiring for me. And we would chat, and unlike the other mentees, it typically goes like an hour or an hour plus when he and I would talk, because he had just done so much research and he came with ideas and questions. And through that, I just felt like it was during the pandemic that I got a nice shot of rejuvenation myself. Like, this is what philanthropy can do. This is what the nonprofit industry can do for people who either are in the field or they're retired, but they like the sense of giving back, and they're just hungry to learn how can they improve. I've talked to other mentees who were working specifically already in fundraising and just looking to expand their skills or get into a different sector. So thank you, Jon, for giving me that chance to be a mentor. It was really cool.
Well, it's a volunteer role, so I truly am grateful that you would have done that, especially hearing that some of your conversations went over an hour long. But yeah, it's a relatively, I probably should stop calling it new, but it's only been in the past 3 years-ish that we've added this program to the student experience. And it's a fully volunteer network of mentors, which has been tremendous. And I think many, though, have exactly the experience that you had, where there is some inspiration in talking to people who are, just trying to figure this all out, being a sounding board. And so, yeah, it's really, part of what I always say, we do some webinars sort of to just share what the program is about. I'm just inspired when people show up. It is such the field that we're involved in is so impactful, and just that there's people who are interested in helping to fund the missions that are so important across so many different organizations. I think sometimes we forget that these important organizations need funding to exist, and that there's actually people behind that who, whether they're on the front line or part of the overall experience for that individual, those people matter. And it's really inspiring to see that, even if they're just interested. It's really cool.
Really cool. Do you, or people, maybe if there are other people in the program on the admin side, do you have a sense of how many participants, graduates, then go on to either a role in nonprofits, or they get the training, the education, and it helps them with going up the career ladder or things like that?
I don't have a lot of specific data because that can sometimes be hard on programs that operate a little bit leanly, and it can be hard just to gather that information. But sort of anecdotally, we hear a lot of success stories. One of the other parts of the program is there's the CFRE, which is a certification within our field, has a requirement for education component. And so this program, many people will take this program as the educational requirement, and then they'll sit for the CFRE exam. And do quite well.
Awesome.
So that's sort of a point that we use. But I think a lot of people, their eyes are open. I mean, my favorite part is pretty early on. We go into prospect research in the program, and this isn't just because I'm on the Zoom with you, Tim, but there are so many people who are like, I didn't know this was a thing. I didn't know this existed. I love it. And how can I? And so there are a lot of people who maybe had a frontline job, or they were coming into it thinking, oh, I'm going to have a frontline job because that's what everyone does. And then they go through that module in, like, I think week 2 or 3, and they're like, oh, there's a whole other part of fundraising. I'm even more excited than I was.
That's cool. And like, we mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation, people, the terminology that people fall into fundraising, whatever particular sector they go in or role, that was my experience too. Like, I just had no idea about prospect research, and really just happened by temping right down the hall from where your office is, actually, with the major gift team in 2000. And Kerry Cietanno was awesome and instrumental in alerting me that the prospect research team down the hall on the 4th floor had a FTE research, junior research position opening up. I had no idea what prospect research was, but it really was a good fit for my skill and interest. And I definitely think if I had been aware of the BU program back in the day, that would have been really incredibly valuable for me in assessing and determining, are there other interests and skills I can develop that maybe I could take to stewardship or maybe frontline. So it's just a great, worthwhile program. So thanks for talking about it, Jon.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes. I want to be mindful of your time. I did have a few other questions. One that I think could be particularly enlightening, given all of the various interesting elements you've talked about with relationships and moving within the institution, but in different roles. Was there a specific moment or experience, Jon, where you felt or thought that the frontline fundraising perspective or aspect suited you well?
So in looking at that question, I was remembering, so I had the great opportunity to work with an alumnus who was the head of private equity North America at KKR. And it was one of those buildings, position, and all the trappings of like old school money management, big wooden desks, suits and ties, all that sort of stuff. And I was relatively early on in my time as a class officer, meaning I was running reunions and managing volunteers. And I met with this gentleman, and he was kind of tough, asked a lot of questions, kept me on my feet. Like earlier in this conversation, he didn't precede me with the questions. And we just went back and forth. He sort of shared some of the experiences he'd had in the past. I was able to share how excited I was to work with him in his class, and got to sort of a good place. And then as we left the building, or as I was leaving the building, he very kindly walked me out, and he put his sort of arm on my shoulder as we were getting coats, and he said, I've had 2 people in here in the past couple of years, and they've left. So you're not leaving, right? And so to me, that sort of summed up, a couple things. It made me realize that, hey, maybe I'm doing okay in these conversations. I'm sure if I did not, he might have been happy to have me leave and try someone else. But 2, it's sort of the fact that I felt really good about that gave me sort of this internal sense of, I really like this work. And it really, I don't think I stayed working at Harvard Business School during that period of time because he said that. But I also would say I reflected on that conversation often as well. And then I had the great opportunity to continue to work with him for a number of years, work with him through a number of great gifts to the institution during our capital campaign. And then unfortunately, he unexpectedly passed away. And so I was at his memorial service, and I've continued to work with his widow and get to know her and help her continue his legacy with things that were important to him, both in giving of her time and resources. And so it's been, that's sort of, it's a really sad thing that obviously happened, but it just shows what sort of being committed to this work and committed to this organization and how inspiring the people can be. And those are the moments where I sit there and say, yeah, I think I'm supposed to do this. And it sort of fits my mentality a bit and my personality and the empathy to have. Because a lot of this work is also, it's not always as dramatic, obviously, as someone passing away, but a lot of it is about empathy. It's figuring out what's motivating to people. It's responding to things, even if it may not be something that matters to me. If they're really, upset or excited or whatever it is about something, figuring out how to really help feel that with them and sort of work through that with the institution that you're working for.
That's very touching, John. Thank you for sharing that anecdote. And it just goes to show that, these comments, gestures at key moments in a young professional's career can have a ripple effect and go in various directions for good in this example. So thank you for sharing that. We could end it right there, but any of the last thoughts, John?
So I'm just gonna end, I think, with two things. I think one, we focused a lot, both at HBS and at BU around racial equity. And there's since the murder of George Floyd, this has obviously become something that has come onto the radar. I would say that for me, it's something that I had not been paying too much attention to, either personally or in the field, and have been able to commit a lot of my time and thought to figuring out what are the opportunities where I can positively participate because I've had so much privilege and opportunity in this field. And what that's led to is a lot of development around the concept of inclusive fundraising. And I've been able to partner with actually the executive director of the Mass Cultural Council, who used to run the ART, a theater here. He's a Black individual and has been able to help develop content and programming for the BU program, as well as sort of push my thinking and development. He's a former student, so he was able to, we were able to just be really sort of upfront with each other on sort of what's going on. And I think that as well as a bunch of things that I've been involved with here at HBS, as we've sort of figured out sort of from the bottoms up and the top down, how we can be each thinking about this and then collectively thinking about the challenges. Because I do think it's an important issue for our field and something we need to figure out how to better address the unevenness of opportunities. So that's, I would say that is something that I've been spending some time thinking about and developing and having experiences. And then the last thing I would say is there's been a lot of research out there recently around friends at work. And I think I am more and more convinced that the reason I am so engaged in my work is that I have at least one very good friend who, it's someone that I would just encourage everyone to cultivate those relationships internally, because, when you have that moment that I expressed earlier, when you feel really good about your job, having someone who you can share that with and they can share their exciting moments, it's what really can feed you. And it's different than a friend from college or a friend from the neighborhood, because they care about your work and they know your work a little bit differently. So I would leave you on, I would encourage everyone to invest in finding those people that you work with who can also be your friends, because the statistics on how much happier that makes you in your job are like off the charts.
Absolutely. Jon, those are two great points in conclusion here about the inclusive fundraising piece. I've had a few guests on earlier in the summer that talked about that. Jessica McNeil at Harvard Business School is on a task force. Not necessarily about inclusive fundraising, but just more of the full lens, broad perspective of diversity in education. And then Neda Jimenez has talked about what she called a beautiful rainbow of colors of diversity in the fundraising profession in the Boston Metro. And she has about 90 people, I believe, participating. So I'm not sure if you're connected still to Neda, but there may be some collaboration themes there. And yeah, I go ahead. Sorry.
I was gonna say, I was just on the phone with her the other day.
Oh, dynamite. See, it's all about those relationships.
It's all about the relationships.
And I liked your concluding piece about finding and cultivating, investing in friends at work, because that's been very helpful for me as well. And part of that dividend is that I've got very generous people that want to come on this program as a guest, including Jon. So Jon, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure and fun to connect with you and hear your thoughts. And thank you for sharing the broad range of experiences and ideas that you have.
Thank you, Tim. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. And for our audience, thank you for your investment of time in watching or listening to these podcasts. You can find Jon's on my website, peopleinfundraising.com, next Monday, October 31st, Halloween, as well as on LinkedIn next Monday as well. So thank you all for your support and have a good rest of your day.